It was, as Miss Jane Marple liked to say, a Christmas fit for postcards, the kind that made even the most cynical villager nod in appreciation at the sight of snow-tipped hedges, the sound of distant bells, and the comforting aroma of roasted chestnuts drifting from the baker's doorway. St. Mary Mead had outdone itself that year. Every window glowed with amber light, and the village green sparkled under strings of modest but lovingly arranged decorations. Yet beneath all this Yuletide charm, there lingered something else, a faint tremor of excitement tinged with the sort of anticipation that often precedes either a grand celebration or a most inconvenient scandal. Miss Marple, comfortably settled in her neat little cottage at the end of the lane, had just finished knitting the last row of a pale blue scarf intended for young Tommy Henderson, the vicar's son. She smiled faintly at her own handiwork, folded it neatly beside the hearth, and allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction. For once, she thought, Christmas in St. Mary Mead might pass without incident. But fate, so often drawn to quiet corners, had other intentions. Across the narrow hedge from Miss Marple's cottage stood the Laurels, a house recently purchased by the Christmas season's most intriguing arrival, Mr. and Mrs. Edward Markham. They were, as Miss Marple's maid had whispered with no small excitement, the talk of every teacup in the village. Edward Markham was a retired industrialist, charming, stout, and blessed with the sort of hearty laugh that seemed designed to fill rooms and reassure investors. His wife, Margaret, was younger by nearly 15 years, elegant and rather too fond of expensive perfumes. Rumor, naturally, had found its way into every corner of St. Mary Mead, that she had been a secretary before marrying him, that her tastes were rather more modern than suited the parish, and that she had little patience for the domestic simplicities of village life. Nevertheless, when the Markhams had sent out invitations for a Christmas Eve backyard gathering, good cheer and mulled wine for all neighbors, the entire village had accepted with enthusiasm. Such hospitality was rare, especially from newcomers. At 6:30 that evening, Miss Marple wrapped herself in a thick grey shawl, pulled on her gloves, and stepped into the crisp air. Snowflakes drifted lazily under the glow of the street lamps. From the direction of the Laurels came the sound of laughter and the faint notes of a gramophone playing, "I'll Be Home for Christmas." She arrived to find the backyard transformed. Fairy lights twinkled across the garden hedges, a large bonfire crackled at the center, its smoke curling into the starry sky. Tables were set with mince pies, punch, and sandwiches. The guests, wrapped in wool coats, scarves, and festive cheer, stood in little clusters, balancing teacups and gossip in equal measure. Miss Marple was warmly greeted by Mrs. Markham herself. "Oh, Miss Marple, how lovely of you to come," said Margaret, her red lipstick immaculate even in the cold. "Do help yourself to some punch. Edward insists it's the best in all Hampshire." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "How delightful, my dear. It's so very kind of you to host such an affair. Quite the undertaking." Mrs. Markham laughed, a little too brightly. "Well, Edward insisted. He thought it might mend fences, you see." "Mend fences," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Oh, just a turn of phrase," Mrs. Markham said quickly. "You know how village tongues wag. I dare say a bit of goodwill does wonders." It was then that Miss Marple noticed a peculiar thing. Standing slightly apart from the others was a woman of about 35, plain-faced, wearing an older coat and gloves that had seen better winters. She stood rigid, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Markham with an expression that was neither admiration nor friendliness. "Ah," said a voice beside Miss Marple. It was Colonel Melrose, retired army man and part-time terror of the local bridge club. "You've noticed her, have you? That's Alice Porter, used to keep house for the Markhams before Margaret took over. Word is, she was dismissed last month. Not on good terms, I hear." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, sipping her punch. "How very unfortunate so near Christmas." Melrose gave a grunt. "Yes, well, if you ask me, she's still got a score to settle. Always had that look about her, one of those grim types who remember every penny ever owed them." Miss Marple's eyes, however, had drifted to another figure, a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver hair and sharp features, speaking animatedly with Edward Markham by the fire. "That's Dr. Felix Grant," said Melrose. "New physician in the district. Quite the talker, bit too smooth for my liking." "And the young lady with him?" "Ah, his niece Lillian, visiting from London. Sweet girl, though she's been rather troubled lately. Lost her position at some art gallery, or so my wife tells me." Miss Marple nodded. It was all very interesting, as things in St. Mary Mead tended to be when people believed they were merely chatting. By 8 o'clock, the party was in full swing. The fire burned merrily, carols played, and even the vicar had abandoned restraint long enough to laugh at Mr. Markham's booming jokes. The air smelled of cinnamon and pine. Then, quite suddenly, the laughter stopped. A scream sliced through the cold night air, a woman's scream, high-pitched and dreadful. Miss Marple turned sharply. Near the far edge of the garden, beside the small ornamental pond, a figure lay sprawled upon the snow. The guests surged forward, gasping. It was Edward Markham. He was lying face down, one hand outstretched, his glass of punch shattered beside him. His complexion, even in the dim light, was oddly pale, and a faint froth had gathered at his lips. "Oh, heavens!" cried Mrs. Markham, dropping to her knees. "Edward, Edward, speak to me." Dr. Grant was immediately at her side, checking for a pulse. His expression shifted from professional calm to grim finality. "I'm afraid it's no use," he said quietly. "He's gone." There was a collective intake of breath. A few ladies began to cry. Colonel Melrose muttered something about shock and fetched a blanket. Miss Marple remained very still, her sharp blue eyes fixed not on the body, but on the glass, the rim of which bore a faint, unnatural residue. She noticed the slight shimmer of something crystalline near the spilled punch. Mrs. Markham was sobbing now. "It must have been his heart. He's had trouble before. Oh, please, someone fetch the constable." The constable did arrive, young Inspector Davies, earnest but inexperienced, still new to the ways of real investigation. He took statements, examined the scene, and concluded, perhaps too quickly, that the death had indeed been due to heart failure. "Cold night, excitement, bit too much punch," he muttered. "Happens more often than one might think." But Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Mrs. Markham's trembling hands, on the glass, and on Alice Porter's pale face in the crowd. The former maid stood perfectly still, her lips pressed together, eyes unblinking. No, Miss Marple thought quietly, there was something amiss here, something quite out of place at this otherwise Merry Christmas affair. As the body was taken indoors, and the guests began to disperse, Miss Marple gently placed her empty teacup on the table, tightened her shawl, and murmured to herself, "Heart failure, indeed, but I dare say hearts seldom fail without help, especially in St. Mary Mead." She turned one last glance toward Mrs. Markham, whose face was streaked with tears, yet whose eyes betrayed something else entirely: fear, guilt, or perhaps relief. Whatever it was, Miss Marple knew, by the faintest flicker of instinct, that this Christmas would not end with carols and good cheer. It would end, as they so often did in her quiet little village, with the uncovering of an unpleasant truth. The morning after the Christmas Eve party dawned grey and still. The snow, which had seemed so festive the night before, now lay heavy and unwelcoming upon the hedgerows. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys across St. Mary Mead, but there was little of the season's usual joy in the air. The shocking death of Edward Markham had settled upon the village like a damp fog of unease. Miss Marple, never one to linger in bed when something demanded attention, rose early and made herself a modest breakfast of porridge and tea. She sat by the window, knitting needles idle in her lap, as she considered the events of the night before. She had seen that residue on Mr. Markham's glass, seen, too, the curious way his wife's expression had faltered when the doctor announced he was gone, and that faint scent, almond was it, that lingered in the air. Miss Marple was well acquainted with such things. One did not read household hints for country women for decades without learning that the faint odor of almonds was seldom associated with anything wholesome. Her reverie was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Inspector Davies, looking pale, nervous, and very young in the cold morning light. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, doffing his hat. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Not at all, Inspector, she replied pleasantly. Do come in, you must be half frozen. He accepted gratefully, stamping snow from his boots. Thank you, ma'am. I thought it best to speak to a few neighbors this morning, routine enquiries, you know, and well, you were there. Indeed I was, said Miss Marple, pouring him tea, and quite a distressing evening it was. Have you spoken to Mrs. Markham? Yes, said Davies, looking uncomfortable. She's terribly upset. Dr. Grant signed the death certificate, heart failure, says there's no need for further investigation. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled over her teacup. Oh, and you agree, Inspector? He hesitated. Well, to tell you the truth, Miss Marple, I'm not sure. The thing is, Mr. Markham was as hearty as a bull from all accounts, and a few guests mentioned he seemed in perfect spirits earlier that evening. Yes, Miss Marple murmured, and then he was dead within minutes of taking his last drink. That is rather abrupt, don't you think? Davies frowned. You think there might be something wrong with the drink? My dear Inspector, said Miss Marple mildly, I think there might be something wrong with somebody. Davies looked alarmed. You don't mean murder? I should be very surprised if it were anything else, Miss Marple replied calmly. In my experience, when a man dies suddenly at a party, surrounded by friends, it is seldom due to the mere enthusiasm of the season. She saw him swallow hard. Well, he said finally, I suppose I'd better have another word with the guests. Would you, mind if I asked your help, Miss Marple? You seem to have a way of getting people to talk. Miss Marple smiled. People do so enjoy talking, Inspector. One need only listen properly. By midday the snow had thickened, and a hush fell over the village. At the Laurels, the festive decorations now looked oddly inappropriate, the holly wreath on the door like a cruel reminder of last night's joy. Inside, the house was subdued. Mrs. Markham sat in the drawing-room, pale and tightly composed, a handkerchief twisting between her fingers. I can scarcely believe it, she said when Miss Marple entered with Inspector Davies. He was laughing one moment, and then, oh, it's too dreadful. Miss Marple, seated beside her, gave a sympathetic nod. You poor dear, such a terrible shock. But tell me, had Mr. Markham been unwell lately? Not in the least. The doctor will tell you that. Edward was the picture of health. Then I suppose it must have been quite sudden, Miss Marple said softly. You see, I happened to notice that his glass was quite full, and yet he had hardly touched it before the attack. Mrs. Markham's eyes flickered. Yes, he'd only just taken it. Edward didn't care much for sweet drinks, you know, said they gave him indigestion. Ah, said Miss Marple, knitting her fingers together, and yet he accepted one. Dr. Grant offered it to him, she said. He insisted Edward try it, said it had a special spice from the continent. Miss Marple caught the faintest quiver in her voice. Dr. Grant, you say, how thoughtful of him. Inspector Davies scribbled a note. And you, Mrs. Markham, you didn't notice anything strange in the glass or taste of the drink yourself? She shook her head quickly. No, I had a glass earlier, but not from that bowl. There were two, one for the guests, one Edward had made for himself and a few friends. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. How very organized. Did he often prepare separate punch bowls? Mrs. Markham hesitated, then nodded. Edward was particular. He liked things done his way. Yes, said Miss Marple with a faint smile. Men often do. The next visit was to Dr. Felix Grant. He received them in his surgery, where the faint smell of antiseptic mingled with tobacco. He appeared confident, if a little weary. Terrible business, of course, he said, polishing his spectacles, but I stand by my opinion. The man's heart simply gave out. I warned him months ago about his blood pressure. You did? Asked Miss Marple politely. How fortunate that you were present last night. He looked at her sharply. Coincidence, I assure you. Mrs. Markham invited me, and as her physician, it seemed discourteous to decline. Her physician, Miss Marple repeated gently, not Mr. Markham. Grant's expression tightened. Both, of course, though she's consulted me rather more frequently of late. I see, and tell me, doctor, what was in the punch? Brandy, cinnamon, clove, orange peel. ordinary ingredients. "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said, eyes mild but shrewd. "Nothing almond-like, I imagine." He blinked. "Almond, certainly not." Miss Marple smiled faintly, curious, because I distinctly remember a faint trace of it when Mr. Markham fell. Grant cleared his throat. "You must be mistaken, Miss Marple. Cyanide smells of almonds, but surely you're not suggesting—" "I suggest nothing," she said pleasantly, "though perhaps you might humor me with a small sample of the punch, if any remains." The doctor's color changed slightly. "I'm afraid I haven't any." "How unfortunate," Miss Marple murmured. "Still, I'm sure the constable might find a remnant on the glasses or tablecloth. These little details have a way of lingering." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Alice Porter, the dismissed housekeeper. She lived in a small cottage near the church, tidy but threadbare. Alice opened the door with a wary expression. "What do you want?" she asked flatly. "Only a few words, my dear," said Miss Marple kindly. "About poor Mr. Markham, you must be terribly shocked." Alice snorted. "Shocked? No, not after what he did." "And what was that?" Miss Marple asked softly. "He threw me out like a thief, that's what. I'd worked there since before she came along, the lady with the fur coats and the London airs, said I was unsuitable for the household image." She spat the words bitterly. "He didn't even have the decency to give me a proper reference." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "That must have been very hard. Still, you went to the party." Alice folded her arms. I was invited, if you can believe it. Her idea of charity, I suppose, thought it would look grand to the neighbors." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you notice anything strange last night?" Alice hesitated. "Only that he and the doctor were thick as thieves, whispering together by the fire. And later, Mrs. Markham went into the kitchen looking upset. When she came back, she had that fake smile of hers plastered on like paint." Miss Marple smiled gently. "You have sharp eyes, my dear, very sharp indeed." That evening, as the snow fell thick and silent, Miss Marple sat by her hearth with her knitting once more. Inspector Davies had gone home, full of confusion and half-formed suspicions, but Miss Marple was thinking deeply. Dr. Grant's eagerness to dismiss the death. Mrs. Markham's tremor when his name was mentioned. Alice Porter's bitterness and her account of whispering by the fire. It was not one thread, but several twisted together. She looked up at the clock. 9:30, a knock sounded at her door. It was young Lillian Grant, the doctor's niece. Her eyes were red from crying. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't know where else to go," she said. "I'm frightened." "Come in, my dear, sit by the fire. There, now tell me everything." Lillian took a deep breath. "It's Uncle Felix. He's been different ever since we moved here. He and Mrs. Markham, well, I think there's something between them. I saw her crying in his surgery once, weeks ago. And last night, after Mr. Markham fell, Uncle went into the kitchen and poured something down the sink. He told me never to mention it." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Did he indeed?" "Yes," whispered the girl. "And this morning, he said we might have to leave the village soon. He was packing a case." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm. "You did the right thing, my dear. You've been very brave." As the girl left, Miss Marple sat for a long moment, the ticking clock the only sound in the room. "A woman fearful, a doctor nervous, a servant wronged," she murmured softly, "and a dead man who never liked sweet drinks." The corner of her mouth curved into the faintest smile. "Yes, the pattern is beginning to show." Outside, the bells of St. Mary's Church tolled for Christmas morning, a day that, for the first time in memory, carried with it no peace at all. The morning after Christmas was unnervingly bright, as though the world had decided to shine a little too much light upon the uneasy peace of St. Mary Mead. A cold sun glittered on the snow, and the air was brittle with frost. Yet, beneath this deceptive calm, whispers had already begun to circulate through the village. Mrs. Price at the grocer's swore she'd seen the doctor burning papers in his fireplace at dawn. Mrs. Hartnell declared that Mrs. Markham had fainted in church, though the vicar insisted she had merely slipped. And at the post office, Word had it that a mysterious parcel addressed to London had been collected from the Laurels that very morning. Miss Marple, of course, knew better than to rely on gossip. Gossip, she often remarked, was rather like goose fat. It coated everything but offered little nourishment. Still, it could sometimes hide a morsel of truth if one were patient enough to find it. She spent the early hours writing a polite note to Inspector Davies, requesting that the punch bowl, glass shards, and tablecloth from the party be quietly sent to the county laboratory for analysis. She did not expect him to understand the urgency, but she knew he would at least try, and that was enough. By noon, she decided it was time to make a few social calls. For in her long experience, the truth of a murder was rarely found in the evidence. It was found in people when they thought they were merely conversing. Her first stop was the Laurels again. The curtains were drawn though the sun shone brightly outside, as though the house itself wished to hide from the day. Mrs. Markham received her in the drawing room. The woman looked exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, her once perfect hair now slightly undone. She was dressed in morning black already, though the death had not yet been officially declared suspicious. "My dear," said Miss Marple gently, "I do hope I'm not intruding. I thought perhaps a little company might ease your mourning." Mrs. Markham forced a wan smile. "You're very kind, Miss Marple. It's all been so dreadful. The police were here again this morning, asking questions, though I hardly know what to tell them." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, folding her hands. "It's a dreadful burden being questioned about one's own husband, and at such a time of year." Mrs. Markham looked away. "He could be difficult, Miss Marple. Edward had strong opinions about everything, how the house should run, whom I might speak to, even how much I might spend on dresses. It was, well, rather stifling." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly, "a controlling man. I've known one or two, and yet you seemed quite devoted." "I tried to be," she said quickly. "He was a good man in his way." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze mild. "Tell me, my dear, did you know that Dr. Grant means to leave the village?" Mrs. Markham's head jerked slightly. "Leave?" "Yes, my dear. His niece mentioned he's packing a case. I thought it rather sudden, so soon after the tragedy." Mrs. Markham hesitated, then said, "Perhaps he needs a change of air. This whole affair has upset him deeply." "Oh," Miss Marple murmured, "no doubt it has." There was a silence. The clock ticked faintly on the mantelpiece. Then Miss Marple said quietly, "Mrs. Markham, there is one thing that troubles me. Your husband, you said, disliked sweet drinks, yet at the party he accepted one from the punch bowl." Mrs. Markham's hands tightened on her handkerchief. "Yes, he didn't want to offend the doctor. It was Felix's idea." "I see," said Miss Marple gently. "Then it was not you who offered it." "No," she whispered, "but I saw Felix add something, some spice, he said." Miss Marple nodded slowly, rose, and laid a comforting hand upon her shoulder. "Thank you, my dear. I think you've helped me more than you know." Her next visit was to Dr. Grant himself. She found him in the surgery, packing like a man whose nerves were unravelling. "Miss Marple," he said stiffly, "I'm rather busy this morning." "I shan't detain you long, doctor," she said pleasantly. "Only, I thought it rather unfortunate that you intend to leave us. Such sudden departures are always misunderstood." His eyes narrowed. "Who told you that?" "Oh, you know how news travels in a village," Miss Marple said lightly. "But surely you don't mean to abandon your patients at Christmas?" Grant gave a short, bitter laugh. "Abandon? I'd say it's the other way round. They've already begun to whisper, haven't they, about me and Margaret Markham." Miss Marple regarded him evenly. "Whispers are seldom kind, I'm afraid." He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Yes, she came to me months ago, bruised, crying. Her husband could be harsh. I only ever tried to help her." "Of course," Miss Marple said, "and yet you brought him a drink last night." "I was being polite," he said sharply. "He asked what was in it. I told him, ordinary punch." "And the special spice?" He froze. "What do you mean?" "Mrs. Markham said she saw you add something." He turned away. "A pinch of nutmeg, that's all." Of course, Miss Marple said mildly. Still, you must admit, Doctor, it's most unlucky that the man you were rumored to dislike should die moments after drinking what you offered him. He swung round, eyes blazing. Are you accusing me of murder? Certainly not, said Miss Marple, her voice calm as ever, merely observing how curious life can be. People do die at the most inconvenient times. When she left the surgery, she noticed a faint scent on her gloves, a medicinal bitterness, not unlike the smell she detected near Mr. Markham's body. She smiled to herself. Nutmeg, indeed, she murmured. That afternoon, she walked to the vicarage, where Colonel Melrose and his wife had gathered for tea. The Colonel, always eager for intrigue, nearly leapt from his chair when Miss Marple entered. "Ah, Miss Marple, I said to my wife this morning, you mark my words, Jane Marple will have this sorted before the new year." "Dear Colonel," she said, seating herself, "you give me too much credit." "Not a bit," he said, pouring tea. "If you ask me, that Dr. Fellow's the guilty one, shifty eyes, always talking too much, and now he's running away, what more proof do we need?" "Proof," said Miss Marple mildly, "is precisely what we lack." Mrs. Melrose leaned forward. "My dear, everyone knows that woman, Mrs. Markham, isn't as innocent as she looks. She and the doctor are in it together. Poor Mr. Markham must have found out. It's all too obvious." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Things that appear obvious rarely are, my dear. Still, I confess there is something curious about Mrs. Markham's grief. Too neat, too tidy." The Colonel frowned. "Then what do you think happened, eh?" Miss Marple sipped her tea. "I think," she said slowly, "that someone wished Mr. Markham dead, and someone else is being made to look responsible. But who gained from his death, that's the real question." The Colonel blinked. "Gain, you mean money?" "Not always," Miss Marple said. "Sometimes people kill for love, or for revenge, or for the simple, dreadful fear of exposure." That evening, as Miss Marple returned home, she found Inspector Davies waiting by her gate, his cheeks red from the cold. "Miss Marple," he said excitedly, "the lab sent word. Traces of potassium cyanide in the punch glass. You were right." "I'm afraid I usually am," she said gently, "and the bowl itself. Clean as a whistle, not a trace." "Ah," she murmured, "which suggests the poison was not in the bowl, but in the glass." Davies nodded grimly, meaning someone had to add it separately. "Precisely," said Miss Marple. "A small dose slipped in at the last moment, perhaps while pretending to add nutmeg." Davies frowned. "So the doctor—" "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "but perhaps not. Remember, my dear Inspector, it is the one who benefits most who must interest us." "Mrs. Markham, then?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Too simple. She might have wished her husband gone, but she wouldn't risk doing it at a public gathering. That's the mark of confidence or desperation. And Mrs. Markham, whatever her faults, is neither." Davies frowned. "Then who?" Miss Marple glanced toward the dark outline of the laurels, a single light glowing faintly in the window. "Tell me, Inspector, have you checked Mr. Markham's will?" He blinked. "His will?" "Yes, for in my experience, nothing reveals truth so quickly as the promise of inheritance." The following day brought fresh revelations. Inspector Davies arrived mid-morning, visibly agitated. "You were right again, Miss Marple," he said, holding a document. "Mr. Markham changed his will a fortnight ago, left nearly everything to his former housekeeper, Alice Porter." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Ah, now that is interesting." "She claims she didn't know," he said, "but I'm not so sure." "Nor am I," said Miss Marple, "but perhaps not for the reason you think. Tell me, does she strike you as a woman who could calmly attend a party, knowing she was about to inherit a fortune?" Davies hesitated. "No, she seemed bitter, yes, but frightened too." "Precisely," said Miss Marple, "because she may have known something was going to happen, even if she didn't plan it herself." She leaned back, eyes distant in thought. A new will, a jealous wife, a sympathetic doctor, and yet, what if the one we least suspect holds the final piece? Davies frowned. Who else could it be? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Why, the one person no one noticed, the one who served the drinks. He blinked. The maid. Precisely, poor little Ellen, quiet as a mouse, invisible among her betters. Yet she was the one who carried the glass from the table to Mr. Markham. Davies stared, but why would she? Because, said Miss Marple softly, someone told her to, and I dare say she thought it was harmless. Her eyes shone with quiet certainty. It's all coming together now, Inspector, but we must let the truth reveal itself naturally. A little patience, and the guilty will expose themselves, always do, you know. Outside, the church bells rang faintly through the snow, their echo carrying across the village like a distant warning. Miss Marple gazed out her window, the faintest smile on her lips. Yes, she murmured, the stage is set, and the next act will show us who among them wears the mask of innocence. By Christmas morning, St. Mary Mead had returned to its deceptive calm, white roofs gleaming, smoke rising gently from brick chimneys, the air crisp with frost and faintly scented with pine and oranges. But beneath the polite greetings and church bells lay something else entirely, unease. The news that poor Geraldine Partridge's death might not have been an accident had begun to seep into every parlour and post office queue. Miss Marple, however, had not stirred much that morning. She sat by her small fire, knitting as always, but her mind was far from idle. Between each delicate loop of yarn lay the arrangement of facts, small, seemingly trivial observations that had refused to leave her. She reviewed them quietly, like a good housekeeper examining her list before a great dinner. There was the peculiar smell at the party, faint, sharp, metallic, not just from the brandy or mulled wine, something clinical. Then Geraldine's remark about a little something for her nerves. And of course, the curious incident of Nora Lacey standing beside the punch bowl just moments before Geraldine took her glass. And that letter Miss Marple had observed in the firelight, the half-burnt envelope addressed in a distinctly male hand. Then the greatest puzzle, Geraldine's sudden burst of laughter just before her collapse. Not fright, not pain, but something like bitter amusement. Why laughter of all things? Miss Marple murmured, setting her knitting down. She made up her mind then. There were still some loose threads to tug. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Grant, was the first to receive her that afternoon. The poor woman, still flustered from hosting the police inquiries, poured Miss Marple a cup of tea with trembling hands. "It's dreadful, quite dreadful," Mrs. Grant said. "Inspector Craythorne says it might have been poison. Poison, can you imagine? And on Christmas Eve, too." "Indeed, it's very sad," said Miss Marple softly. "But I wonder, dear, was it known who prepared the punch?" Mrs. Grant blinked. "Why, Nora Lacey did most of it, I think. She brought the spices, you know. Geraldine was helping at first, but then she went inside to fetch her scarf." "Ah, and no one else went near the punch afterwards?" "Well," Mrs. Grant hesitated, brow furrowing. "Roger Partridge, perhaps. He came over to get a glass, and later, Dr. Lacey himself refilled the bowl." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes thoughtful. How very industrious everyone was, quite the shared effort. Mrs. Grant gave a faint smile, but Miss Marple had already drifted into thought. By dusk, she had called upon Inspector Craythorne at the Partridges' home. The police had taken residence in the drawing room, which now looked quite bare, stripped of its festive ribbons. The inspector frowned when he saw her, but gave a respectful nod. "Good evening, Miss Marple. I should have guessed you'd come sniffing about." "Oh, not sniffing, dear Inspector. Merely thinking," she said mildly. "It's so easy to overlook things when one assumes too soon, don't you think?" Craythorne sighed. "We've established it was poison digitalis, most likely, taken with the punch. We've confirmed Geraldine had a weak heart, so at first it might have passed for a natural attack. But there's no mistake. Someone dosed that drink." "Digitalis," Miss Marple mused. "Quite potent in the wrong amount, and dreadfully easy to obtain if one happens to know medicine." The inspector glanced at her. "You mean Dr. Lacey?" Miss Marple's tone was mild. "Or perhaps Mrs. Lacey. Wives of doctors often help with their prescriptions, you know. They can be remarkably knowledgeable about such matters." Craythorne frowned deeper. What motive would she have? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were drawn to a photograph on the mantel, Geraldine and Nora, side by side in a summer garden, smiling. The friendship had been real once, but something had soured. She turned back. Tell me, Inspector, has anyone mentioned a letter? A letter? Yes, I noticed Mrs. Partridge burning one in the hearth the night she died. I couldn't help but think, people only burn letters in such a hurry when they fear what others might read. The inspector's eyes sharpened. We found some burnt paper in the grate, didn't seem much use. Miss Marple smiled faintly, perhaps not to everyone. Later that night, Miss Marple requested that everyone involved, Roger Partridge, Nora and Dr. Lacey, Mrs. Grant, and the inspector, meet once more in the Partridge drawing room. The snow outside muffled sound, creating an air of frozen stillness as they gathered. Roger stood grim and pale. Nora Lacey avoided his eyes. Dr. Lacey's face was unreadable, and Mrs. Grant hovered nervously near the window. "Why have you called us here, Miss Marple?" Roger asked tensely. "Surely this isn't proper." "My dear Mr. Partridge," Miss Marple said kindly, "I think it's quite proper when the truth has been so tragically misplaced." She stepped forward, her delicate hands folded. "You see, it all began, I believe, not with a quarrel or a fit of temper, but with love. Misplaced love, perhaps, or rather, love betrayed." Her eyes flickered to Nora. "Mrs. Lacey, you and Mrs. Partridge were close, were you not?" Nora swallowed. We were, yes, years ago." "Indeed, and then came a letter from a man you both knew, perhaps from before your marriage." Nora's eyes widened. "How did you?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "It's quite ordinary, dear. The postmistress is not the only one who notices handwriting. The letter was addressed to you, but opened by Mrs. Partridge in error, or perhaps curiosity. It seems she discovered something rather unpleasant about her friend's past." Roger turned sharply. "You mean?" "That Mrs. Partridge had once been engaged to Dr. Lacey, and that their romance ended abruptly when he chose Nora instead," Miss Marple said quietly. "A sore wound, I imagine, and one not easily healed, especially in a small village." Nora's lips trembled. "It wasn't like that. Geraldine, she never forgave me." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "No, I don't suppose she did. And so, when she invited you both to her party, she meant it to be cordial, but beneath the surface lay years of bitterness." She looked at Dr. Lacey. "Your wife knew that Geraldine still resented her. That letter perhaps rekindled something painful. When she saw Geraldine teasing you, whispering over the punch bowl, perhaps suggesting she might reveal something to your patients, she panicked." The doctor shook his head. "Nora wouldn't." Miss Marple raised a hand. "I believe she didn't mean to kill her. She only meant to frighten her. Digitalis, after all, in a very small dose can make one ill but not fatal. But Geraldine's heart was weak. You, Dr. Lacey, would know that. Your wife did not." Nora's face had gone pale, her hands twisted in her lap. "I only wanted her to stop," she whispered. "She was laughing at me, and I couldn't bear it any longer." The inspector moved toward her gently. "Mrs. Lacey, are you saying you put it in the punch?" Tears filled her eyes. "Just a drop, I swear it. I thought she'd be sick and go home. I never meant." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, then said softly, "I thought as much. It was a very human mistake, dreadful but human." The silence that followed was heavy. Outside, the snow continued to fall, as though the world itself sought to cover the ugliness beneath its clean white blanket. Finally, Roger Partridge spoke, voice hoarse. "Geraldine was no saint, but she didn't deserve this." Miss Marple looked at him gently. "No one ever truly does, Mr. Partridge. That is why we must all guard our hearts carefully, for sometimes it's not hatred that kills, but wounded pride." Later, as the others dispersed under the watchful escort of the inspector, Miss Marple lingered by the window. The village was once again quiet, the twinkling lights soft against the darkness. Mrs. Grant, still tearful, turned to her. "You always see things others miss, Miss Marple. How do you do it?" "Oh," Miss Marple said with a faint smile, "one learns, in a village, that human nature doesn't change, only the decorations do. Christmas trees or summer fêtes, it's always the same heart underneath." She pulled her shawl tighter and gazed out at the snow. "Such a sad business. Still, I dare say the village will gossip less harshly once it knows the truth." Mrs. Grant nodded faintly. "And to think it all began with a Christmas party." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "a Christmas meant for goodwill, but even goodwill can be poisoned if mixed carelessly." And with that quiet observation, she took her leave, her footsteps fading into the night as church bells rang once more, soft, solemn, and oddly peaceful, over St. Mary Mead. Snow still lay heavy on the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead the following week, though the crispness of Christmas had mellowed into that quiet lull between holidays. The tragic events of the Partridges' party had, of course, set every tongue wagging from the butcher's shop to the churchyard gate. Yet, as always in English villages, gossip gave way eventually to routine, letters to post, kettles to boil, curtains to draw before dark. Miss Marple had returned to her gentle habits, though those who knew her well might have noticed a certain reflective distance behind her kindly blue eyes. She sat that morning in her parlor, the little coal fire crackling merrily, a pot of tea steaming beside her. The Daily Chronicle lay open on her lap, but she was not truly reading it. Instead, she was thinking, not of guilt or punishment, for those belonged now to the courts and the inspector, but of the strange, sad frailty of human hearts. A knock came at her door, light, hesitant. "Come in," she called. It was Roger Partridge, looking older than his 35 years, his face pale and drawn beneath the brim of his hat. In his hand, he carried a small box, wrapped neatly with brown paper. "Miss Marple," he began awkwardly, I just wanted to thank you for what you did." "My dear Mr. Partridge," she said, rising with a kindly smile, "there's nothing to thank me for. I only noticed what others didn't. That's hardly heroism." He shook his head. "It is, though. You saw through all of it, the lies, the pride, the pity. I didn't even know Nora Lacey was capable of such a thing." Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea and gestured for him to sit. "We are all capable of much, Mr. Partridge, both good and bad, when we are frightened. Mrs. Lacey was frightened of losing her reputation, her husband's respect, her very sense of place. Fear, you know, can be a deadly motivator." Roger stared into the fire. "And Geraldine, I suppose she brought it upon herself. She could be cruel when she wanted." Miss Marple's tone softened. "Perhaps, but I think, more than cruelty, she was lonely. Some people express their pain through malice because they cannot bear to be pitied. It's a dreadful thing, loneliness, especially at Christmas." He nodded slowly. "I've been thinking of selling the house. Too many memories." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Perhaps you should, dear. A fresh start can do wonders for the spirit. Just don't make it too far from the village. We'd all miss your company." A faint smile crossed his lips. "You're very kind, Miss Marple. Always so calm about death, aren't you?" She chuckled quietly. "At my age, one learns to be practical about such matters. Death is only shocking to those who pretend it will never visit them." He stood then, setting the wrapped box upon the table. "It's something of Geraldine, her favorite book, A Christmas Carol. She'd want someone like you to have it." Miss Marple's expression softened. "That's very thoughtful of you, Mr. Partridge. Thank you." As he left, she gazed at the parcel for a long moment, then gently untied the string. Inside lay an old copy of Dickens, the edges worn, a sprig of dried holly pressed between its pages. She smiled faintly and whispered, "Poor child." That afternoon, Inspector Craythorne called. The snow had turned to a light drizzle, and he arrived damp and irritable, stamping his boots on Miss Marple's doormat. "I thought I'd bring you the final report," he said, holding out a folder. "Case closed. Mrs. Lacey's confessed in full. Digitalis, just as you said. Seems she took it from her husband's supply cabinet." Miss Marple accepted the file but did not open it. "I do hope she'll be treated gently. She's not wicked, only foolish, and remorse, I imagine, is punishment enough." The inspector grunted. "The law'll decide that, but between you and me, I don't think she'll hang. Likely a term in Holloway, maybe less. The jury'll pity her, pretty thing, all tears and trembling. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. I've often thought, Inspector, that pity is the final indulgence the English reserve for the guilty. It's much rarer for the innocent. He looked at her sharply, then laughed. You're a sharp one, Miss Marple. Never know what's going on behind those needles of yours. Oh, it's mostly wool and habit, she said modestly. But sometimes, in between rows, one catches sight of human nature, and that's more intricate than any pattern. He chuckled, tipped his hat, and departed, leaving behind a faint smell of wet wool and tobacco. That evening, the vicarage was warm and bright again. The Grants had decided to host a small gathering to lift the spirits, as Mrs. Grant put it, though everyone knew it was as much to discuss the case in privacy as it was for comfort. Miss Marple was there, seated near the fire, a plate of mince pies beside her. Around her, familiar voices rose and fell, Mrs. Price Ridley lamenting the tragedy of modern nerves, Colonel Melchett insisting the police should tighten the noose on domestic poisoners, and Mrs. Grant fluttering between guests with tea and scones. It's rather dreadful, isn't it? Mrs. Grant said softly to Miss Marple, to think it all began with something as simple as a Christmas toast. Miss Marple nodded, sipping her tea. Yes, indeed, though I dare say it wasn't the punch that was poisonous, but what had already been brewing between them. Mrs. Grant sighed. You make it sound almost inevitable. Oh, not inevitable, dear, just predictable. When people allow bitterness to simmer too long, it tends to boil over at the most inconvenient times. Christmas seems to draw such feelings out, love and resentment alike. Colonel Melchett leaned in. I still say, Miss Marple, you'd have made a fine inspector. You've the instincts of a bloodhound. She laughed lightly. Oh, dear me, no. I've only the instincts of a spinster who listens. That's quite enough in a village like ours. A few days later, the sun returned, pale but warm enough to melt the last of the snow from the rooftops. The church bells rang again, slower this time, for Sunday service. Miss Marple walked through the lane with her basket, pausing to greet Mrs. Price Ridley trimming her hedge and old Mr. Davies sweeping his front step. Life, as it always did in St. Mary Mead, had resumed its gentle rhythm. Yet as she passed the Partridges' house, now empty, its windows shuttered and path untrodden, she felt a pang not of sorrow, but of reflection. It had all happened so quickly. A moment's spite, a drop of poison, a village forever changed. And yet, how quietly it all would fade into the tapestry of village history, one more whispered story, one more name in the vicar's book. Miss Marple stopped by the gate, her gloved hand brushing the frost from the latch. In her mind, she heard again Geraldine's laughter, bright, brittle, echoing through the night, and Nora's trembling confession. She sighed softly, so much harm for so little gain. Then, as if shaking off the thought, she straightened and continued down the lane, her step steady, her eyes bright beneath the winter sun. That evening she sat once more in her parlour, the little room filled with the ticking of the clock and the faint hum of wind against the window. On her lap lay Geraldine's A Christmas Carol, now open to a familiar line. It is required of every man, she read softly, that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men and travel far and wide, and if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, indeed, Mr. Dickens, and some of us, I dare say, begin our haunting long before we are dead. She closed the book, set it gently aside, and turned down the lamp. Outside, the church bells chimed the hour, and all was once again still in St. Mary Mead, that curious, quiet village where life and death so often danced hand in hand beneath the English snow. And in that stillness, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the yarn soft, the pattern steady, her thoughts drifting like snowflakes, calm, observant, and endlessly curious.